borona de zo song je gan yang wa rong san ju gan wang ze dong ze ba za ye la me ja la so wa ne mong ka dong nyam bi sen jia dong ji mang jia la na me ba yong da ba zu ba song ni je gong po rong bo tie ji ni ju de ba xia di che de dong bi jun de ni san ni dong yang song long yi jiu wo xiang song ba xiong xi ju de san xi bi gu ni san ban ca.
Rinpoche first requests us to turn our hearts in loving care to the welfare of all beings and to give rise to bodhicitta, thinking that we will study Dharma in order to bring each and every sentient being throughout the vast limits of space to utterly pure, totally perfect, precious enlightenment. And in our study of Dhamma, in order to help other beings, then this afternoon we will be studying the chapter on vows and commitments from Janggon Kongtrul's Treasury of Knowledge. But this having been said, we can't go through everything that's in that chapter. There isn't the time during this course. Rinpoche said, even without having to use an interpreter, when he taught this in Varanasi, in the college, it took a solid month to get through the chapter, so we need to look just at the main meaning. The vows are very famously known as the 3 levels of vow.
Da machila na number sang yo bare de number sang yo ji di jela na da di dunga xie yin ba ma gong ba le dunga den bar xie ba de tang ji da gong wa xie ba gong de tang ji dunga me bi ta dunga xie ba xie bi ta da number man da sang yo bare da ta la ne tian ni da number sang xie bare.
They're known as the 3 levels of vows because they are 3 sections of commitments which help us not to act in this life in a way which engenders suffering in a future life. In this life we act through what are called our 3 doors of body, speech and mind. We act physically, we act verbally. Our mind's activity is also action, and when these are not controlled, then harmful actions in those 3 areas are what brings suffering in a future existence. So the whole point of these 3 areas of work, of commitment, of dedication, is to prevent suffering in the future.
Yaki goni tatayon dunga mobunyu hiyo bare magon palayon ta te mabona jimayon ta tera ne tiani dunga mobotinyu leon hiyo bare ta te induran di dunga te thamje dati ka yinanda magon pi ka yinanda ti dunga thamje ponyi thala ni tomba songji ji ta ni duni ta mandaba.
The sort of actions that these vows help us to control, to avoid doing for the negative ones, or to help us to do for the positive ones, these are the ones which, first of all, in this life, do harm. They do harm to their doer, to ourselves, and they're the sort of actions we do with our body, with our speech, or the way we use our mind that harm ourselves, but also lead to harm to other people in this life. But not only that, those same actions don't just cause suffering now, they lead, through the power of karma, to the experience of suffering in the future. So in his great kindness, Lord Buddha has given us the means to avoid those sufferings in this life and in the future life, and the way he presented this is on 3 different levels. These 3 areas are famously known as the vows or the precepts of self-liberation, or if we use the Sanskrit, the pratimoksha vows. They are the bodhisattva vows, and they are the vajrayana vows, or the tantric vows. It's 3 different areas of commitment, and of course if one can practice all 3 simultaneously, that is the best, but in themselves they cover 3 different areas of control. If we look at these 3 areas of vows, they're actually presented in the order of ease of practice. So if we take the example of learning to read and write, then the simplest things come first, learning the alphabet, and A, B, C, and then one needs to learn how to put that together and gradually develop it into language. It becomes more subtle, more sophisticated. Very obvious things come first. So like this, the pratimoksha vows are the easiest to understand and to apply. The bodhisattva vow is more difficult, and the vajrayana vows are the most subtle and the most difficult. Apart from this sort of, how can you say, formal presentation of the vows, just something to say very practically about them, is that at first sight, these vows don't look very enticing. It's don't do this, better not to do that, avoid this. It's not the most attractive of things at first sight, until one understands that actually it is there for our happiness. It is there to bring happiness. So a very good example of this is medicine or treatment when you're sick. If you are ill, then the medicine may not be very good tasting. It may not be a very pleasant treatment. But if you know that medicine is going to make you a better person, and that in the long term you're going to be healthy because of it, then you'll be very, very happy to take it. So in the same way, when we have these rules of discipline, which preserve us from entering some fields of action, which bind us to a certain dignity of conduct, at first the strictness and the fact that some of the, how can you say, the nicer tasting things are proscribed, isn't that the word? Yes. Yeah. It doesn't look so good, but then if you know that the long-term result is happiness, then one will have a very different approach.
디노니 다 통화 소소 타바도 베나 소소 타위가 서라긴 거지도 다 류어 역성거노니 다 조너 류동 어거 다写못 받으라 대요 바래 되니지 저게 못 봐. 무슨 못 봐. 다 노나는 라소 봐. 조도 다 류동 어거 거니 다 능하시지. 다달라 능하시지. 마공파라 능하시지. 다 디두죠 되자. 미파시지 다 디년보 동바송스도 히요 바래.
When we look at these three types of vows, the first section are the pratimoksha, or the personal liberation vows. And if we think of our possibilities of action, we can act through physically, verbally, or with our mind. Now these first set of vows, pratimoksha, deal with physical action and verbal action. Physical and verbal, body and speech. So it is these sort of commitments such as not to kill, not to tell lies and so on, activities we do with our body and with our speech. So these are there to help prevent physical suffering, prevent the suffering that's created by what people say, both in this life and the future life. They're there as the remedy to this suffering, to this suffering.
니 용시 생비가스니 조 류동어 마연바 다 산도 내가 요바래 니 산지고니용 다 예라나 뒤져 젬바 상바 년바 요바 쯔바 니 루고고니 나용 예나 데바 뭐고고니 예라 만비 라소바 다 두보데차 시모슈 더 시나용 다다용 능하시바 마옹바라 능하시바 롱예용 능하시바 예라용 능하대바 다 든진다고 요바 인디디라는 대통지 시문예지 설더라 송바리
When we turn to the bodhisattva vow, there, although it covers, bodhisattva commitments cover body, speech and mind, the entire focus is on the mind. Not simply on the actions of body and speech. So there one's understanding how the sort of attitude that we have towards other people, physically, verbally, the way we think of them, whether we have respect for their physical presence, the way we think of them, everything that happens in our mind with regard to others is the main focus, because one realizes that the cause of creating suffering for beings lies, the root of it lies in the mind, and so the bodhisattva vow is about nurturing the mind which is behind the actions.
드니 화가 가서라기나는 다조 생 드니들라는 다 논나는 두보이나라 야보이나라 카조한의 생시용 히오바리 드니들라는 다 생거 니서도 덤바 다 그런 생거 롱게 가리 어디나 디 니서도 덤바 조시니 다 연례시동도 히오바리.
The Vajrayana vows are also concerned with the mind, but in a different way. Rather than being concerned with the superficial workings of the mind, the day-to-day workings of the mind, they're concerned with the nature of mind itself. They're concerned with mind itself. So whether that mind is being good, or whether it's being bad, whether it's thinking this, or whether it's thinking that, the Vajrayana vows are there to preserve an understanding, to nurture an understanding of the nature of true reality, the nature of mind itself.
다 대인들라는 소타라 송생 다 디domba 송아 대통제도 다 롱라용 대화시지 마옹바라용 다다라 대화시지 마옹바라용 대화시지 연라용 다다용 펜바시바 마옹바라용 펜바시바 다 롱연 이가라 너는 니가도 다 탐지 펜바도 대화용지지마도 디노라는 능하시지 sentia dungari, ronya dunga jiki, ten yoba mare.
When we consider these vows, when we see actually what they do, then they bring happiness now, in this life. They bring happiness for the future. They destroy suffering now. They destroy suffering for the future. They benefit us. They benefit others. The happiness they bring is both provisional happiness and the ultimate happiness. Whichever way we look at them, there is nothing but goodness, there is nothing but the removal of suffering and the awakening of happiness.
Pena da geshiba, sojeba. Da la soba de tangje, rongye nyegala noji ma do pemba mandua. Deni samba ngemba, jowa zeba, senong dujo, ha dujo, jen, da de chi de nya, rongye nyegala pemba ma do no pa mandua. Deni ni zu do mantaba, loba do ba, mayiba yimba, sonong dong de na, rongye nyegala pemba, nyuji mandua dujo chi ji, no pa chi ji ren dua. Te yin la na, no so zong ho san de, no chu du ga na, rongye nyegala pemba do dewa nyuji ma hi ma do, dino la dunga chi ji ten yoba mare.
When one looks at this very realistically, first with the first set of precepts which cover physical and verbal actions, to kill others, to harm other forms of life, to insult others, to use one's speech badly, it doesn't do any good. It hurts others, it hurts us, there's no goodness to it. If we look at the second set of precepts, the Bodhisattva's nurturing of the mind, when our mind is full of disrespect and hatred and lack of love and these things, it's no good for us, it's no good for anybody. And when we look at the Vajrayana level, then to not know the true nature of ourselves, of our mind, of existence, means, by definition, that we're wandering in ignorant views of reality. This is not doing us or anybody else any good. So by following these commitments, we avoid that unwholesomeness, that harm, and we are taking care of happiness, of something that preserves others from harm, preserves our own mind from harm, and that nurtures a true understanding of reality.
Ta de yin de la nona no jiten ji ne lu do man tan ba ni no song ba ngen ba shu ba ngen ba yo wa ngen ba ta ngen ba ma lu ba ka chong wa zhu min je ni ta me ba xie chong wa de la no song ji ji mi do yo ba de me ngen ba du jo ka chong wa de ta ka chong wa de pa me le tong
If someone can manage to completely get rid of those various areas of harm, so that there's no harmful or distorted understanding, there's no harmful mental construct, there's no harmful application in terms of what we're actually doing with body and speech. If all of those harms can be gotten rid of, then someone who's done that is called a Buddha. That's what a Buddha is. It's someone who has removed each of those aspects, from the gross to the subtle aspects of harm and distortion.
대마도 다 송지제 연바지 공용 요바 말이 너는 알아서 마공발라 송지 그 말이 이 송지리 되나 다 가린다고 쳐놓을 되나 두쪽 그냥 아카 좋아 매바쳐 대 카통아도 파뽕 유차디 되라는 되니 니스도 탐바 쳐놓을 말이 니스 코로 가리 요도이나 되니 대 레지다라는 되니 송지제 대 디미도 도가 말이.
So Buddha is not something or someone other. When we promise or when we aspire to become a Buddha is not some other sort of being. It is someone, it is we can say someone, it is whatever it is, something, a state, it is something without even the slightest bit of any of those harms. That's it. When every fraction of physical, verbal harm is gone, when the mind is without any of these harmful things, noxious things within it, and when that mind is totally at one with the true nature of reality, the very way that things are, that's what a Buddha is. That's when we do those things, we are automatically Buddha. It doesn't mean becoming some different type of something. When all of the suffering and the harm's gone, there's nothing but happiness. And so a Buddha is automatically, by very definition, happiness. When every suffering, every distortion has been destroyed, completely removed, then there is nothing but natural happiness. We are sentient beings, and as sentient beings then, we have sometimes bad minds, and bad motivation, they make bad actions. We're sentient beings, we have pride, we have attachment, we have aggression, we have jealousy, we have stupidity, and because of those things, then what we do brings suffering. We're sentient beings. We suffer because of those things. That's how we are. And it's because we take the bad things sometimes to be good, the harmful things we think they're pleasant, that we are stuck in this suffering.
대인하나 송지가 가리고 말에 지나는 다 누가 탐제도 논이 용도 대인이 되라나 대년보다용 논이 종인제 들리잖아 대야 말로 반주사 대용 다 산논이 된다 되면 신고 가를 야지요 가서 이제 제보죠 가서 또 제보죠 가서 권위 제보지 쳐야 되네요 대만 중시들이 뭔데 dunga gdido dunga chojindago jiredini ta dewa nyungse de karere de ngdulana ta ngaro ndi lunga yas ndi di tola re de nonga re de di me shala mundu tani deni dunga da lunga yas ndi di to ni deni soje jang ni dewa de zawa dewa de deni chunyu deni sheyo bare.
If we think who got out of this suffering of being a sentient being, it's who got totally out of this suffering, the Buddha, and the Buddha alone. And the Buddha was free from all of those things and showed us how to be free. And the road to that freedom from suffering is in the practice, and that is within us. It's particularly within our mind, how we use the mind. If we look more completely, it's how we use our body, speech, and mind. And it doesn't matter what's outside, it doesn't matter what possessions we have, what the material circumstances of our life happens to be on the outside. Nothing from the outside can bring liberation from suffering like the Buddha found. No matter what the circumstances are, no matter how wonderful, elaborate, complete, whatever, nothing on the outside can do it. It has to be the work that's done within what we call ourselves, that is within our body, speech, and mind, of which the mind is most important.
Then there are the Dritsala, Tangaros, Motonche, Samba Mandava Yobare. This Samba Mandava Yopala Tiani, they are Dritona Mandava Yobare. Malalaga, Tanika Naruchipore Saditela Mahombala Son Motonke Yopare. Malala Ina, Mahompa, Rimola Song to Yopare. Malala Ina, Nakiba Mayimpa. Ta Maronga Jakado, Marie, Timothy, Taki. Zamboni, Sancha Katsoma. Dindizo, Donano, Sombala, Tochi, Dinanda, Sono Tonto Mandava, Divatela, Dredi Obare, Druton Obare, Tapi, Denda, Rontidego, Deva Druton Mandavala, Tiani, and Dika Selinayon, Deva Dresatirayon, Sandra Obare.
And I think I forgot to mention in that last one, the Buddha is the one who found the total happiness, and then it is by using our body, speech and mind that we can find the finest, the best happiness. As far as using the teachings in order to become happy are concerned, then there are different sorts of people, different sorts of Buddhists. Some have a more short-term perspective. They're thinking of actually the way Rinpoche expressed it is happiness now. That's the shorter-term happiness. Others have a much longer-term view. They're planning for a really long-term happiness. And yet others, but just the way they are naturally, are very concerned for everybody. Their thoughts stretch out to many, many, many other beings, maybe even to encompass the whole world, and their concern is how to bring happiness to everyone. People are different, their attitudes, their motivations are different.
Nanji jisu lopan toba nanji shonji sanje damba hieni dinyon lenshi. Tani no ngoji dambar jisu lopan nanji ta sonji ji kumpong toba sonji ji jisu lopan toba nan di jisun ju ni tani ngoji damba hio dinyon lenshi. Ti tani se hong ta dona no drajong ba dong shonji sen ba dong sonji ji jisu lopa dobi lo dong tani tani sota shonsen ngodi ta nomba sanda wuji goni hio bari.
There are so many different attitudes and motivations amongst Buddhists, and the teachings cater for all of these. They correspond to these different attitudes. And in particular, if we follow the teachings of the great master Atisha, then he points to three types of Buddhist, and those three types of Buddhist are defined by really what inspires them. I think these days we probably say role model. It doesn't say that, but it means that. It's who inspires you, who is your role model. So one group is inspired by the arhats, who gain total freedom from all of the problems and imperfections of the mind. A second group are defined by their role model, which is that of the bodhisattva, with all of the bodhisattva's compassionate activity and understanding. And so then the first group, who are inspired by the arhats, they follow what we could call the common way or the general way of Dharma, the lesser way, the common way. Those who follow the bodhisattva's path follow the greater way of Mahayana. And those who are particularly inspired by the Buddha himself follow the way of Vajrayana. Of those three types of inspiration and practice, the first ones particularly focus on the pratimoksha.
소소 가리조 탄로아리라나 니 dom바데다 츠연더 송니 소소 타비가 스키비 dom바데다 츠연더 송 연례야보 이세나 소소 코롱 송캔더 리투 니리 탄로 요바레 다정도 공부토니 노나나 코이 니리 탄로아레 소소로 연례시니 소소로 탄로 요비세나나 소소 타바시 다들이라디.
The word pratimoksha means personal liberation. Prati means oneself, moksha means liberation. And when we look at what this means, then it means that if we keep those vows, the pratimoksha vows, then the person who keeps them will become liberated. Liberated from what? Liberated from rebirth in any of the 6 realms. And if we take all the 6 realms together, we can say equally liberated from rebirth in samsara. So through that we understand liberate oneself, the vows of personal liberation.
다 대라는 다 사지 제 통과요 바래 다 주드나나 다 사지 제라고 지고 니기나 린두 다 대가리라고 지나는 오 드니는 예와 드니는 시위 땡 동봉오 드니 예와 하야 드니는 시위 땡 뭐가리라고 지라데 소소 답이 넘바데 시리지 시위 땡 드니는 마토바 토바 시바 타 당화 마토바디 다 토바 시지 드니 다 토바디 뭐냐바 송거라 다 가리즈 송거리 송서 드니 녀하는 시주서 아야 드니는 동이죠 가리즈고 다 동바 동도와디 드니 동비 편염 다 드니라고 지 너는 사치 지 요 바래
맞습니다. Yeah, the pratimoksha vows are described in this particular presentation by Drupon Khenpo through 8 categories. First, we learn about their essence, which really means a definition. We're defining what those vows are. It's called the essence. Then we look at what's called the classes, the various details of each class of vows. Then we look at what's called the basis, which means the individual who's suited to take those vows. Then we look at the actual method through which the precepts or the vows are received. Then we see how once the vows have been taken, how to protect them from deterioration. If they have been deteriorated, how to restore them if something's gone wrong. The 7th area is I think it's the criteria for loss and losing the vow completely. And then 8th are the overall benefits of keeping the vows.
안드니 밀라나 안가로서 롱소소라 센소라 손노 동거두 단디 노라나 카츠와 농바리 다 농바이나나 다 게냐니 다 라중 바다 너는 농바 공으로 이게 차와 코나리 되니 롱로젤라나 농바요 소메 농바 야포 토요소 토메 다라라 손노 동거두 되니 domba yapo to mena 되니 domba 용기 시거든 되니 domba yapo to de 요나 다 가바고니 와당안 진두가 domba to de 소지 하고거든 domba to mena to de 요노 샤디나 더 패면도 더 리본 좀만도 되니들라나 다 domba 제게 가린다고 지거든 뭐 이거 맞다 domba로 그절라 통거서 통면도 다 도면나 다 지망하러 domba 히디티라 domba 가린다 오이시니 도지시에 근두 송 너는 샹주 domba 면나 농바 송지 때니 말이 되나나 다 샹주 domba니 존이 너는 게누지 바도 domba 해진두 소사라 리 문다바 모모두 디 너다 가리히나야 너나 소소 타바레 디 domba다 다 농바 신사도 되라 휴먼 캐메레 다 휴게나 농바 말이 휴거나 농바리 옛날에나요 농바 혀 마히니 다 마도 봐요 된디서 말이 되나나 다 통은 것은 통만두 다 도지 가린다고 지 건두 다 봉봉고니 sonno 모통 세건두 디메 예마가 로용라고 돈다면디 가리지나 가론도 녀란신이 세도니 做세기고 말이 되니 세도니 녀란 세두라 다 생각이도록 문이 돈바든 두소 문두 다 가린다고 지레 그 sonno 히자시니 도기도.
So the first of these, about the essence, leads us to reflect on what are these vows, what are the nature of these precepts, assuming that we're all Buddhists, so that means everyone has taken refuge, then these precepts, which assume the basis of refuge, then go from a layperson's precepts all the way through novice ordination, up to full ordination for men and for women, if we use the word ordination, which isn't quite correct, but anyway, let's use it, because everyone understands it. So then we need to understand what it means to, what the vow is in its essence. What is this, how can you say, sacred bond? What is it that the vow really means, this inner commitment to a certain nature of goodness? We need to understand what it means, to know very clearly what we have received and haven't received, how to receive it, what it means to receive it properly, from whom, through what ceremony once you've got it, then how to preserve what you've got once you've got it, how to preserve it once you've got it, how to preserve it from deterioration, and when it's lost, when you die, and this sort of thing. All of what exactly a vow is needs to be thought about, what it involves, what it implies.
아 동보 소소 타바 동바 천니도 덴바지도 히나 토 요나 다 느리도 손도 보고도 로니 혀바 동도 니니 아 닌준고 건니 롱 로니 혀바 동도 니 혀바 동도 니디나 다 데바 토바 동도 니니 드니 닌준고 건니 롱니 본당 호동 지바 다 셈바티 소소타비 도미 오레 로니 키와 당데 니니 라디티라나 다 로니 디바토바 당데 니니 닌주고 건호 야부지거든 닌주주 건호 야부 세제다 다 가리레 라나너 코위 리 둘라 다 동가 저롱게 야부지 임바 하고 데리 다 타바시지 셰거든두 데 타바르 셰바데 다 루지고니 수지바 마즘바 마송바쇼바 ngogogoni zan tama tisa ngwachalti da lungogogoni mugeba dang da zo xebi di bongsan de da chen le yoba de soso tabi dangban cheni bi ngodre da.
The defining characteristic of these pratimoksha vows is an understanding, is a dedication to those vows through an understanding of what's being done, accomplished through them. And one of the main defining qualities of that is compassion. It's through compassion that one understands what's going on in the 6 realms of sentient beings, and one understands where the harm is being caused. Where the harm is being caused through how people use their bodies, how people use their speech. And it's this compassionate care for beings which lies at the heart of taking these pratimoksha vows, where we ourselves can take the commitment not to harm with body or with speech. This is what lies at the very heart of it.
다트 가리로지 랄리레 라나너 마로 동보 동바 히와라 동바 히두 동바 히두 데라 가리 트랭거 누라디 데라너 노나너 노바 리투 가나니난지 등하 저롱 게레딘두 다 데리 나 타지 시제근두 드니 디동도 나로고 동바디 힐레 인송 덴디가 송바야 보치 동보 요거두 더 요나나 드니 동바더 생이 바토르도 바데 마인바 베나 나라 네포 네 droba자위서도 동바혀진 요래 라라레 이나나 다 디송도 제 요지 말이 되면 엄마 자간다고 이나나 라라나 가리디나 순소위서도 용 동바혀진 요래 가리디나 라드 신소나 자보고 체바지면 돼 디동다 라드 신 드리시케 요래 따라지나 더 지쇼 그 사전도와리 되면 소소 타반도 말이 다 냐가 여도 뭐시시지가 라도 뭐이 공부시지지서나 들 레몬트 처리를 되면 소소 탑이 넘바 말이 들이나 넘바를 린다면 빼먹는데 빼나 나라 생각에 뒤돌이 동하 먹는데 다티 넘바 손지 배달을 휴가 넘바 휴가는 뒤 동하도 면도 이래서 넘바 휴가나 시사가 domba aridina domba red. Certainly. Redi soso tabi domba tenye bad mari. Mozo tabatoji domba de mari. Tendi indi dirana di sono tonto de yapo chako gundu dombo.
We've seen that the defining characteristic is this compassionate understanding of the nature of the six realms. And of course when it's focused on one's own area of activity, where one doesn't want, one's seeking liberation from the six realms, of course. But we need also to understand that this term pratimoksha, self-liberation, can be applied to the rules of conduct. It's not a good sentence. Can only be applied to the rules of conduct in certain circumstances. So there are the rules you observe, not to kill, not to tell lies, and so on. But just observing those rules doesn't mean that you are observing the pratimoksha. Because pratimoksha means what you're doing must be leading to liberation. So for instance, there were people, there have been throughout Buddhism, but in ancient India, people who became Buddhist as a way of getting food, as a way of protection from royal justice, because in many countries the king and the justice system were not allowed to hurt the monks and renunciates. So there, if you're observing the rules, keeping all the rules of, say, the monk or the nun, but for this sort of self-interest, then it is not pratimoksha conduct. It's conduct, it's keeping the vows, but we can't call it self-liberation vows, because they're not leading to liberation from samsara, they're self-interested vows. The same thing if you hear, the cause of all of that suffering is that, and you think, okay, this is a ticket to happiness, or ticket to happiness in terms of being reborn in the higher realms. We have stories from the early Sangha of Sangha who practiced with an eye to rebirth in the upper states, the upper realms. In that case, because your mind's looking for a samsaric outcome, we can't call it pratimoksha, self-liberation vows. So all those people are keeping the conduct. It's discipline, for sure. Self-discipline, good conduct we can call it, but we can't call it self-liberation conduct. It's only when it liberates us from samsara, so when the motivation is right, we can call it pratimoksha.
Tena this ambato ka chimbo chire ka chungchu chire mendu soda la rigye yo bare seta go soso tabala rigye gno tinola don to teni bare uni soda teni ba di teni ba ri don de gongru mena shongji sembe don ba yo to mendu tani shongji sembe don ba mena hwaji don ba yo to mendu soda ri don gongru koron yyo sheni di sola don ba 송생도 뭐냐가 토거래 되나 되니 나로 gelana 소소 타바 domba teni 바지 메나 되니 domba 기나 이야바트라 카통아데 문디 베나 콤만달라 콤바조 동보면은 니바선바 요마라 베 된다고 소타 나로 야보지 토메나 종지 선바 야보 토면디 야 종지 선바 야보면은 뭐가 domba 야보 토면디 되나 domba 카통아 메바초는디 되니디라 더 be ka chenpo chire du.
This is an exceedingly important point. It's not just a trivial detail, not at all, because this defining characteristic that it is through a compassionate understanding of the nature of the six realms and through living the conduct in order to be free from that is very important, because when that's there, then whichever of the various classes of precept one follows, there are in all 8 classes of pratimoksha precept, from lay precepts through to full ordination, men and women and so on. Whichever one follows, if that defining characteristic is there, then you have the pratimoksha conduct. If it's not there, you just don't have it. We can't call it a proper monk, a proper nun, a proper lay person. Now, if that's not there, then there is no longer the foundation for the bodhisattva vow. The bodhisattva vow relies upon the pratimoksha vows. So if the pratimoksha vows don't have their proper defining characteristic, whatever you're doing by way of a bodhisattva is voided. It can't work, it has no basis. And then, going on from that, everything that we do in Vajrayana implicitly has the right bodhisattva commitment and the right pratimoksha commitment as its foundation. So just as if you don't have the first floor of a building, you can't have a second floor and a third floor. If the pratimoksha is not there, the rest just cannot simply exist. So this is why it's such an important point that those vows need to have the proper spirit behind them.
Ta te tawago ninchung ko samba. To ta jinche mepachi yogaleri dina ta ngarong sala gun kali kabure. Jinche mepachi womare. Te kakari hore kakamere. Yena yung dombo ngarong ko domba hidu tela. Ta magi ping harol. Teri nga domba hiyayi. Domba hiyajet ta domba se hir genunda gesenda yingamadu. Pena genya ka domba hiyana domba re. Domba tsenyi pare. Sandu domba hiyana domba tsenyi pare. Ta nomba songji bi gora hiyana domba sandu domba mena ndimendu ha. Ko yinga matare. Ti hidu tela na teri nga domba hiyajet ta ngama nga dunga ka tswa le toji. Ri dul amase de 너는 타바 토지 그 뒤동동하고 힐이 대한지가 니도 동부 요거든 니마 힐이 지슬라 힐이 용 진짜 메반다고 된디 요거면도 동부 가로 힐이 되라 왜나가 천투나가 꽝하거나 당가 뒤동도 천투가 아성지 동부 요거든 니마 힐이 진짜 메바 거면도 앞에 된다고지 동부 동바 힐이라 뒤송바데 인기면 요거든
준체게 고라 양자실은
진짜 메바 요거면도 힐이 ninju가 송바데 힐이 진짜 메바지데 세나 된 거면도 동보 힐이 되라는 뒤송바데 요거도.
This outlining of the defining characteristic is particularly relevant to the taking of the vows. As far as a formal definition of taking, of acquiring the vow is concerned, then that motivation needs to be the reason why the vow is taken. If the vow is taken with that motivation, then the vow has been properly acquired. It doesn't mean that motivation has to be perfectly maintained at all times, otherwise you lose the vow. With the case of the pratimoksha vows, that's not true. That needs to be the motivation at the time of taking the vow. If that's the reason you take it, then you properly receive it, and after that you have that vow.
Ta te indu tela no ngaroso domba hiwi kasala ninju ko samba de leosi ngaro tina kali khabo injira ngaro tendu pena ngaro rajina ngalo cheji titola gesa ko domba hiwi tidula ninju ko samba ha ko hime lo cheji tila ngalo cheji titola nga domba hidu tila ninju ko samba ngara ko dunga jerong yere nga ta teli teji ge sada nga domba hili ni te ngaro ga te ma so teni nga da bo yo ma hite jero so ko phasya domba hili te la na teni te yo se kali khabore nga te ndi.
So this is the way it's presented. Rinpoche said this is difficult. he himself took his vows when... I left out something before. He gave the example of drinking water from a cup, and he's saying you drink the water from the cup and that refreshes you, I think, but you don't drink it all the time. You're refreshed so you can speak. But anyway, it was an example. But now he's saying, if he remembers himself when he was 14 and he took the vows, he can't honestly say, I was fired up by compassionate understanding of the nature of the 6 realms, and for that reason I took the ordination. He said, if we're truthful. He said, probably here, he doesn't know for you, but when he says it's not easy, it's difficult, but that's how it ought to be, and that's the meaning of when it's so properly acquiring the self-liberation vow.
Lala no ta nomba sonji pepe ya pu re ngaro te la hyugo son domba hyugo sa yo jire. Lala ya nga pe du nga mo bu du te ni na nomba sonji pe ta la hyugo domba hyugo na te zo du nga de me so na chi ki te tin yong domba hyugo kan yo jire. Son no la do na mi ma da ba yo ba re. Domba hyugo la ka so na da chwa ma re.
So the reasons that people actually do take the precepts vary from person to person. Some people, they feel there's some goodness in there. It's a good thing to do. They feel Dharma, the way of the Dharma, has something very precious and wholesome about it, and they just know it's a good thing to commit themselves to it. Other people are sensitive to the suffering inside themselves, inside life, and they feel that the solution's in there. It's by following that way that there can be some relief of suffering. It's sort of part of that story that Rinpoche just defined, but there are all sorts of reasons that people do take these types of precepts.
Ta ngaro so jelana domba yapo yo re de yo re so yo mare lana. La domba yapo re de yo jire. La domba tono yapo yo jimare. Ngaro ko tendu. Ta gari che ko domba yapo che ga san du. Ta ngaro gari che ga re lana. Ta on son no chi tong du. Ta domba yong ji che ga re, ta gari re ga re lana. Ta ngaro so domba de tong cha domba de hyo cha na domba yong sa ba re ni hie cha ka ka re. Rong je la domba de tong me domba de yo na. Ta ta la na ki pa tong jin do zi men zha ba ni yo re. 니 케파 라라 가리송 거리라나 다 domba ni nje jindu se domba dujo da domba yapo chire jindu isi lali sona da domba dujo da domba yapo chire jin mundu isi 송지 다 또 케파 통제 ninju면나 소단 체니바 무소 송건du isi 다 나로서나 ninju면나 다 소다 톨리 말이 소다 domba yapo 문데 되니 lali 라나 다 domba tosan duisi. Zik den rikies ni ore.
Dampala karasong son de kap la tompo yap yo.
Tan arong sala son no tona. Malala domba yojire. Malala domba yapu kali kabore. Dore.
So in Rinpoche's own reflections, in his own observation of things, he thinks some people really do have the vows, and that other people maybe don't really have them. They've taken them, they've gone through the ceremony, but whether they really have what's really meant by the vow, which is this sacred bond with something or not, he doesn't know. And he said also, as far as scholars go, then there are actually 2 main streams of opinions amongst scholars. Some say that if you go through the motions of, if you go through the ceremony and you observe the precepts afterwards, you do what you're supposed to do and you don't do what you're not supposed to do, then you have the vow. Other scholars say if you do that, you only have the vow if on top of that you have this defining characteristic, which was mentioned earlier, which is the reason for doing that was this understanding of the nature of samsara and the 6 realms. So scholars disagree about whether actually somebody, in essence, has the vow or doesn't have the vow. And there now we have a 40-second break for changing the Korojo, Kokanta. 40 seconds is a long time in Dharma. It's about 40 on minute per minute.
Ta ngaro so gare so song dong ge nu la na ta ndo no la gare so de la na zhong ga wo dong ho ya de ni no geng ga wo cao ni ra de xiong sa ge song dong sa ji wo de ka so ngaro ni xie yan ni la ta zhong geng ga wo la cao ni wo de cao gu si mo bo ge ni si mo bo ge ni de ta ko geng ga wo de hua jia ge ri de 인들아 대라는 연방 뭐 자니 카토마 세선도 세로도 대라 버거 청신이 러선도 고시 먹어 버거 더 러로도 대라는 건가워도 배 번져라 제바치고래 드니 건가워 버거 청신이 인디 대라는 고 로지들이 니들이 선도 대 코카고 드니 코롱 수래 대소 소디 대라는 코롱 카라더라 코롱 맞아 드니 버거니라 떼래 대대디 대라는 건가워 배그를 하고 저 기로메 들리는 거 알아? 드니래도 손지 전에니 건가보다 저런 그루를 보니까 가리서 저손들이 하고 그러지 찌르래 손라래. 들라디들라 내가 가라 가서 아빠가니라 내가 차오니라 들어대서 된디래 들라대 인송래. 대대송도 되라나 드니 손지 전에니고 대빠가니라도 순간다 야부요리래 넘바히 된디라도 순간 야부는 세디들라 대빠가니라도 순간래. 대 라드 숑로도 되라 되니 라드 숑나 라드 숑아 가지 사주래 되면 엄마 자갈라 라드 숑은 사마도 첨박 사주면데 마로 손다 그래 문데 다단다 문데 라드 숑아 게츠는 거 사마다다 첨박 던지 사주 말에 되니들라 되니 기마 라드 숑로도 되라나 손제 장데 라드 숑로도 코빠가 충신이 배 몽봉의 되라는 연바 통제 거等 차라자래 아 송지 전에 내가 로마 통제 뻐근란 저오 갈 망은들이지 연바가 들라래 들라디 되니 송지 전에 내가 대조조 기보 샤루도 샤 나보도야 들리 파트 터마 코 대조 현주지 들리지래 마송지 받더라 라드 슈모조 세고 tran지래 대대인들라 뒤뒤라 건가고 차오니랑 민주화 사만도지 뻐거래도지 라드 중시 그 자와 가래래들이는 칼로사지 바로도 되니 라드 소관도지 던더바노라 무시고 바로 손이 전에 까가노라 되나 지마티 차오니도 드라좀 바토소래 드라좀 바치 소래 드라좀 바치나 되니 소다 천이 바치 토요거든요 드라좀 바치 jet터면도 되나 돈보를 민주면나 비만 민주 레고도 되라나 돈보 소단 천이바 면나용 지마 소단 천이바 니 제주산 뉴송 되니 개발하고 송히고 바래 다 되니나 땅아로서 배야분도
There's a story from the Vinaya which highlights one of the points of this sort of controversy between the two ways, and it's the story of Ananda. Well, not of Ananda himself, but of some distant cousins of his. And these were two children that were orphaned as a result of a battle. The whole family was wiped out in a battle except for these two tiny children. And Ananda was looking after them. In fact, he was going on his begging round, and he was giving all of his food to these two children. So as the days and the weeks and the month went by, Ananda was getting thinner and thinner and thinner, and the Buddha said to him, "What's happened to you? Because he's all shriveled up and thin." And he said, "Well, I'm giving my food to these two little children." And so what they did is they ordained the two small children, and then they could go out on the begging round. Because in those days, Rinpoche is saying, it wasn't like in Tibet. In those days, people went out every day on a begging round to the houses, and people were happy to give them food and to sponsor them. So then the two small children went out on the begging round, and they got food, but then they were only tiny children, and a lot of the time they were crying, and they were very upset because they lost their family, and they weren't, how can you say, behaving like the Sangha normally behaved, and complaints were received. And so it's after that the rule was made that a child must be old enough to scare crows. It's a sort of a sign. At first they set an age limit and then they lowered the age limit. But anyway, to show that a child is grown up enough to make some sort of decision, to know what they're doing, because these were very tiny. They must be old enough to be able to chase away big crows. So what we can see is that these children took the vows, and they probably kept them fairly okay. Now what happened much later on in their lives, they became arhats. So even though they took the vows without this defining characteristic of motivation, later on that defining characteristic came along, and they became arhats. You can't become arhats without the defining characteristic of the vows. It's impossible. It's a state of mind. So this is a good example about how even though at the time of obtaining the vows the motivation isn't there, later on the motivation can come.
Ta tenje ngaroso on the toni ta ninju ko somba gadu lena ta tidura soda ko ta cheni ba ngaro jela toje on the ton ko na li sabuna nga sundu de metem nena ngaroso pe kali khabundu domba kidura ngaroso ninju pachiya mata khako de kali khabore ngaro tendi teni inana ta ngaroso donana ninju ko somba data mena ta yoga sandu so ko ninju ko somba ya pusie gendu teni 다파도를 민주 선바 대서 해차나 되니 넘바야 붙여도 되니는 민주 선바도 예 같이 버리니.
So whenever this defining characteristic of a compassionate understanding of the nature of samsara and a longing to be free from it, whenever that occurs, then we can call it pratimoksha, or self-liberation vows that you hold. So even if you've already taken the ceremony, you wear the robes, or whatever it is, and you're keeping the conduct, from the moment that that attitude is also there, then it says, you are a person who has now properly received, who properly holds the vow. Then we can call it pratimoksha, and you can be called a true renunciate. And Rinpoche thinks this is quite a convenient way of seeing it, because otherwise, if we say that has to absolutely be there at the time of taking the ceremony, otherwise actually you didn't receive the vows in the first place, this could be really quite discouraging. And on the other hand, if we understand that we take the vows, whatever inspiration makes us do it, and then what we're looking for is that day when that true renunciation is there, which means it really is authentic pratimoksha in the true sense of the word. And of course, if possible, then when actually requesting and taking the vows, if that attitude is there, then that is excellent. If it's not there, then you can't be called, it's a technical term, somebody who holds the characteristic of the vows.
Di lama santore lama cho ni dala nga tho de ga mendu cho jima dala cha jima dala cha samba da ga sala o da Drupon Khenpo Lhabu go da ni da wo se hi ho ji de ti ga sala o da nga rong ji la na da dong ba tho yo da tho sung zhen di luo de yo ge du di luo de ma xie da wo dong ba tho mendu de di la nga ro so dong ba he di so da ri je ga ri hyo na ri dong ri je yo ri 제가 가르쳐도 있나 동보 인중부터 지 지마 톨로시에지도 니다 더면나 더니 domba 전혀 봐도 더니 domba 되는 도문 되는데 되라나 더니 지면이 kiela yapujigo, Tendichegandu, Yalayon, Benana Domba Hinkayola, Chorotombo, Samba Tendigo Gare, Gimatolo Shigare, Parate, Tendichegandu, Dema Domba Yaputo Mandu, the Nana Rongas on Yalayon Tendisi Yapu Lajagandu.
So the thing to understand for our own benefit whenever we take whichever class of the Pratimoksha we do take, the thing to understand is that there are two factors that need to be present. One has just been explained at some length, which is this motivation, which gives us the definition of this word renunciation, renunciate. It's this renouncing of the suffering of the 6 realms of samsara. This is one thing. The second aspect is what we might call the pledge. It's what actually takes place through the ceremony and through what you say. So it's not just something that happens in the mind. There needs to be a ceremony where with our mouths we make the pledge to that end. And whether it's refuge or lay precepts or any degree of ordination, even though the ceremonies differ one to another with actually the words you say, they're all based on a threefold repetition of the refuge or the precept formula. And during the first 2 repetitions, you don't have the vow, you're requesting it and you're aspiring to it. And it's with the 3rd repetition, and when the preceptor snaps the fingers, it's at that moment that you receive the vow. So this thing of, I suppose we'd say, passing through a formal ceremony, it's a verbal pledge needs to be there for you to have the vow. So with those 2 factors, the good motivation, the properly performed ceremony, then you have the vow.
Teni talana temen sodatu, teshan sodati, number niore. Tate domba moton, chipare, samba mandabala tiani, ritni cholore. Gita carriere dena, ronya, tabatozi, quali droni, soni domba huna, temen sodari roare. Sanche, tanche, tabatozi, tondanga killing dena. Teni teshan sodari roare.
As far as these pratimoksha vows are concerned, there are 2 ways of taking them. There is the Hinayana way of taking them and the Mahayana way of taking them. The ceremony for both of those is the same. The motivation is different. The Hinayana way of taking the pratimoksha vow is to take it because one wishes oneself to be totally free from the sufferings of samsara. The Mahayana motivation, or the Bodhisattva's motivation, is to take exactly the same commitments through the same ceremony, but with the motivation of wanting to do it in order to bring all sentient beings to freedom from the sufferings of samsara. So it's the motivation that differs, all the rest is the same.
Tati sotatala pa eva shena, ta karinda uchulilana, jetoma yopare. Tati inditirana de chimbishu, radishun shu, tati niyopara, tati inditinilana chimbala, sam, radishunala, na, de jena yopare, chong.
If we look at the subdivisions of the vows, pratimoksha vows, then there are 8 main categories. 3 of them concern lay people, and 3 of them concern monks and nuns.
Tinuni ta chimbandawo ina ta nyani yanlo jiba, tani no genya pamani, to sandre. 年年老结巴些就大年个出几把的送就得了，年年老结巴的拉的，等你呢大给年当吧，给年当吧等你了，给年大破木你这那这怕嘛你这那这别像那怕嘛是，当我看到我些呢破木你了那个，我要到个上这我都亲笔写个当吧的。
The actual words used a householder and renunciate. So there are 3 for householders and 5 for renunciates. The 3 for the householders are first the temporary vows, the ones that we observe for 1-day fasting or 2-day fasting. So they're temporary, they only last for a day or 2, they're renewed day by day. And then there are the vows for life, those vows for life either for men or for women. So that makes 2 categories. Temporary vows, same vows for life for men or for women, 3 categories altogether.
Tenina rad shware. Ta rad shwala ngayo bare. Tenidira gesela pamani ges pamani. Teni geloma. Ta geloma seje to ges ma. Teni gelu ma traditira ne tipala ho domba chi son ji yong ro gre. Teni ko je de la misanda wo chi ore de sam. Teni gelu la on pomo ni de na da pamani de yo bare de rad shwala ngadi.
If we use the Sanskrit words for those 3, then you've got the Uposita ones for the temporary vows, and the Upasaka and Upasika for the lay people. Then there are 5 types of renunciate. There is novice monk, novice nun. There's what's called nun in training. And then there is full monk, full nun. So these are the Shramanera, Shramanarika, and the Bhikkhuni, the Bhikkhu and the Bhikkhuni, and I forget the name for the nun in training. So this intermediate one for the nuns is after one's taken the novice nun's vows, then it's one stage between that and full nun ordination.
Tenina to this to Dugana Yonda Bare Chambala ni, Radashumala ni, the ni Chambala Yeni and Lojipa, the Genia ni, to the Hamamichi. Hoya Tenina, Radashumala Inana, Gesaton, Gelun Sidima, Tila, Namajiba, Nishi, Gesato Gelu ni, this to the Guanana, Yonda Wuti, Chambala ni, Radashumala ni, Yonda Bare.
There's another way of making these into categories, where we have 2 categories for lay people, 2 categories for the renunciates, and so there it's those observing, we can say observing or training in the 8 precepts as men or as women. So, and then for the renunciates, it's those on the way to being bhikkhus or on the way to being bhikkhunis. So then the novice is like a novice, it's a training. Nun in training is in training. It's what's on the way to becoming a monk or becoming a nun.
Ta de so da ri ye ge no la, chen ye ba ji de dong de me re. Ta di no ni chen ye ba me ro ji ga re ji na na, ni ni yan lo ji ba de. De chen ye ba ma re, ga re ji na ni ge chu ki la ma re. So ni ma ma ya ji ba de si ni chiso nyeki tsaki tse dima mere, koro taga doma mere tsare, te ina na doma tsenyi pa tsamandu pe tu 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 re. Teni yenpa ka tsungwa ta tse shi ka doma re. Shama sun chi pa dara. Teni di tila doma tsenyi pa chor nudu genyan ka doma ni, nwana na genlong ka doma pa da, ka tsungwa da doma tsenyi pa chor nudu re. Teni di la tsenyi pa ji dong. Wanya ta tsenyi pa mayi pa ji ji. Di
If we go back to the 8 that we just had, the 3 lay precepts and the 5 renunciates ones, then of those 8, 7 of them are called vows vows with defining characteristics. You can say someone who has those is someone who holds the vow with its defining characteristics. That's 7 of them, the last 7. The first one, which are the 1-day precepts for fasting, they only last for a day, so we can't say that that person now has the defining characteristics. we don't apply that for the one-day vows. The other ones are taken from the time you take them until the time you die. So providing the vows are not broken, then we can say that person is a person holding the vows with the right characteristics.
Then you koro no si on mandaba ta momboyo parete ta soni jiske gundu.
That's
Then you lana ta ti sota ri don tamba hi swan tsani ba. Ta ti ri don gari in ji miena. Shongji tsenba don ba to mendu. Ho ga don ba to mendu. Yuna. Koro yenda wo de sota ri de gongron ji de koron. Tianda wo gundu. Di do le teni don ba jimani de hyogundu. Then you lana donangaroso to pe ka chebo chirendu chimba domba yinanda ra dushuni domba yinanda domba dombo de yapo jitona teni domba nipa de yapo chosa pare teni samba de yapo chosa pare domba dombo de yapo jimena nipa samba de womandu teni dula tangaroso higaji jik ninja wo yotia dombo ninju yapo sono dong 다 domba jigi de la na yin rimbola sono dong de li kali kabure de yana yo tanga de domba hye de khowa ri tu la ma se se taba tozi dondo hile yin de go sono ya po dong ji de ji deni domba hiwi ka sala to bi tu so de hin wo tanga domba la to song nga je la ta to yo de ji ge lo xie ji de yin ji min ni de ni yo ge du de ni men na de ni so ta to me de ni so ta ma to na The
details of these 8 precepts to observe as a householder, or the various precepts to observe as a renunciate, we will look into more tomorrow. What we'll look at next this afternoon is the fact of whichever one of those 7, one needs to have one of those 7 lasting commitments as a basis for the bodhisattva vow, and then automatically as a basis for Vajrayana vows. It doesn't matter which one it is, but one needs to have taken at least one of those 7 levels of precepts before the bodhisattva vow is effective, and any Vajrayana vow is effective. Without one of those 7, one cannot be a practicing bodhisattva or Vajrayana practicer. It's as simple as that. As far as actually having the pratimoksha, so that you do authentically have the basis for those next 2 stages, then there are 2 factors which define having the vow. First, that there has been this defining characteristic of renunciation. Renunciation is very important, and even if it can't be foremost in the mind all of the time, it needs to be the driving force behind the vow, as we've seen, especially at the moment of taking the vow. There's this real renunciation from the 6 realms of samsara. This is one thing. Then the second thing is the presence of mind that you hold that commitment. It's to know that you lose it when you die, but now you've taken it properly, that at this moment I am bound to, or I'm supported by, however it's seen, it's an acknowledgement of that being within one. So when those 2 things are present, then you are an authentic holder of the vow, and then that can become a basis for the bodhisattva vow and Vajrayana samaya. So we'll leave the formal talk there for this afternoon, and Rinpoche invites your questions.
When we say stress the importance of the defining characteristic of Patimokkha as a compassionate understanding of samsara, I just wondering if you could advise us how to build that within ourselves.
Rinpoche derengi songi nangla, tene de tsenyi chen la ngejung kukendo, nenje la tene kowa le ngejung ngokendo, de ngejung de la sowi che do 공도 배워체도 가르치고 제가 해줘.
인주와 공패는 로지.
그래.
세례소 인주 시지 세례 인주 공패는 로지.
ninja latsane korwage mejo 공도 배워 답가를.
인주 공패 다라나 뭐 던도 당하로 통제더라. 님다 플라도지 냐바도 더자 여도 대저 송지 전에 가가는 마디나 알아서 통문디. 근데 얘나요 뭐도 던도는 알아서 통래. 드니 뭐라 대반도 송 등한도 던도라 대반도 송 등한도 대야부 송노 통문디. 드니 등하 요나 당아티 등하더라 야부문디 배나 만다고 지나요. 시에비 동하 기피 동하 체비 동하 나위 동하 제가 나지 동하 다 또 말이 다 터차리리리서 노동 동하 빼 전부신도 이거지 다 터차 카츠와 메시지 토나 다 야보선디 드니 던로지라서 노동거나 요 가린다고 지 동하 요선디 던로라서 노동나 하고들이 하버리니 다 던로라고 말하시지 당하로 세게도 손지 그로래 와라 드니나나 뭐그 동하라 손노동 야 던로고 등하라 손노동 다 들리시는더니 야비 로지리
although it's renunciation from the six realms and samsara, actually what we can experience of samsara's six realms is mainly humans and animals. Even though the Buddha's teachings tell us about the other realms, we can't experience them, we just hear about them. So the thing we can really do is to observe human life and animal life and think about it and ask ourselves just what happiness there is, what sufferings there are, look around at the world of humans that we can actually experience or know about. And, for humans the main sufferings are those of sickness, of death, so we think what it's like to be human, to die, what it's like to be human and to be sick, and then to be born and to grow old. We think of those things. We just look around at the world and try to estimate how much happiness is there, how much suffering is there, so that there's real experience of it. And then the same thing with the animals. In some ways it's easier because perhaps their sufferings are more obvious, and to look to see what happiness do they have, what sufferings do they have, what possibilities do they have. And that observation and reflection in itself should naturally lead to renunciation. I just remembered I should have been repeating the questions for the recording. The previous question, if it's not too late, where were we? Was about how can we increase renunciation. I think the answer more or less gave the question, but anyway, that was the question. And then this one is that although people know about suffering, nevertheless they're through habit addicted to their patterns of suffering. So even though they know it's suffering, they still do it. Is it?
Well, you could feel compassion. One could feel a lot of compassion, but it doesn't necessarily break the pattern of suffering.
Doesn't lead you to renunciation.
Well, it might be, it's a question of, no, I'm not talking about me so much, but just in general, that considering suffering doesn't necessarily lead to renunciation, and that seems to be the big problem.
Sorry, I didn't get it, because
Well,
you're saying you've seen suffering.
no, the Rinpoche was saying, if you see the amount of suffering around you, the amount of suffering of the animals and human animals around you, then it naturally would tend to lead to renunciation.
Mm-hmm.
What I was saying, I don't want to be too negative about this, but I have seen an awful lot of people suffering intensely and aware of the extent of suffering, but it hasn't given effect to renunciation of any kind.
그런 게 선플라더니 내 몸보 때 코버기 동아 너네 가서 통계도 아니면 라든 동아 몸보 통저 열에 얘네양 몸보 통나 얘네양 매중 여 말에 때 동아 열에 하코나 인지면지 때 매중나 용기 말에 세간다.
Hai. To hung re. Nga ti na. Ne nana ta nga thoma ra me nga nana ga chen khem mo yo ma re. Ne na ji dunga re. Dunga yin ba kha ko na nga dunga ga kha ji ma ji yo ma re. Nga ti na. Pe na zhe ge jia na ca na yo re ti. Ka chong ra zhe ge jia ga bo yo ma re. Nga zhe ge ma ji la re, ka re la na ko dunga jo re. Dunga thona, dunga la tando yore. Pena, ngo nye gambana. Tadu tila, ndiri shere, dime, ta nga nye gambana, ma nga tsadi di, tindi yomare, ma. Dunga thona, dunga tando lo yore. Dunga anthong mantong kongki. Nga chena. Dunga la, dunga thona, dunga tili, tando lo yore. The just a jawre. Martina Pena, what near Gambana? Gambana, Bangatsandi, in Dunduma Machi, the two de la Cochilugan and the Lapajugan and the Chisere. Pena Nenana, Tanganan and Hangani, in Temareta, the Tila Mahon Junore, Cono Carin Dorilana, go near Tina, Tawore, Nenana. Dunga nyore. Dunga thona dunga li tando go lo me me mo go mare.
Well, if I understood correctly, at first Rinpoche said that's really true. There are lots of people who witness suffering on a daily basis, but they don't necessarily have renunciation. But then he said, but surely there isn't anyone on earth, there isn't anyone at all, who once they're aware of what the suffering is, doesn't want to get rid of it. And he gave an example of stabbing a knife into his knee. He says there's nobody who, if they had a knife stabbed into their leg, wouldn't want to take it out. There's nobody, if their hair caught fire, they wouldn't be sitting there thinking, oh, hair's catching fire. You know, they'd be doing something about it straight away. If you're really sick, then you get yourself quickly to a doctor or to a hospital, if you really understand the suffering. So, I won't say any more because he didn't put those two together, but he says, surely when you really understand what the suffering is, then you do something about it. There's nobody who wouldn't do anything about it once you really know what the suffering is.
Reti dungale tabasipi ka takakayore. Pena malala semba chipomena chomo montore. Nika tigi teto pensila sono toni, yerimbola sono motoni. Coron, that's a technica direta de la soni, yerimbola tatso mihi. Then it roll dungatili tatola, tatso to mandabayore. Matu dungala ganke machio mare. The dungali tat or tavi shadala, yerimboto. Then dunga te garinda woji, jensen he me he. Then you get hira chasing la tiani, dunga la dunga don tonton, the ponzo tap mandabachori. Tap mandabayore, matu dunga ganke. Senche Gio Mari. The Dunga Teliwa Tatonla, Dunga Mepache Tonla, Koro Tanke Monkey do G. Londamada Mombo, Hira Cheshana in Ramada Yore. The Mangaros Muchi that you Nana Gala, Namagalare, oh, Nana D. Lamare. To Dunhala Galana, oh, not Dunhala Maganga, Dunhamin Galare, oh, Dunhayon and Andy Lamare. The Dunhala or Tatongo Lord, Hira Cheshana Dani. Tatu Caso Chodore.
So, having established the point that really nobody wants suffering, there's nobody who would want suffering, and everyone would like to get rid of it, but the difference is in the understanding of what that suffering is and in the method for getting rid of it. For instance, somebody might be drinking alcohol a lot. They might be smashed out of their brains and looking happy, but that's a very short-term solution. It's not a long-term solution, but it might feel like a solution in the moment to the suffering. And so there's two things. One is in understanding what's causing the suffering. This causes a difference in how you react to it, and everyone wants to get out of it, but then how do you get out of it? One is understanding what's the real cause of the suffering, and then the second is in how much wisdom there is in the method that's being applied to alleviate the suffering. So then there, people will be different. And
Pena Narosu no Pasonji Big Chu no la, Saint-Jela no Pasiji, Ron no Pasiji, Gio Mari. Yetayong Yamba Tachi Hako Hioba Mari, no Pasonji by Yapu Mari saying a bit momorita. Muni Narosa no Pasonji by Yinkachil, Coron Gonzo, and Yola Semazana, Coron ready with Chumare. Matu, Sonji Songonolana, Saint-Jen, Catwala, no Pamaji, Saint-Jen Saint-Jen Pantogri, says Matu, Saint-Jen so good, the George says Dio Mari, Catwa Yaposi had on your own Chiposi, Saint-Jen Chiposi, Quana the Sumori. Yena Yamaga, Chupe, the Jore, said you the Tendi Yapo Bahako Yobamari. Dunga Mizi Yosi, Tino Tahako Yobama. Then the Yora, the room to take that is on to Kahayo, Dunga City Gamari.
There are some people who don't appreciate Buddhists very much, and they might not have a very good or even a negative opinion of Buddhists, but when we look at the Buddha's teaching, it's really what it's all about. It's simply how to reduce suffering. Who doesn't want to reduce suffering? Who could ever be against the reduction of suffering? It's about how to be happy. Who could not support anything that brings more happiness? That's the totality of the Buddha's teaching. Who could ever disagree with it or find something wrong with it? Yet some people don't like Buddhists, but when one looks, it's trying to achieve what everyone wants, which is happiness, and to get rid of what nobody wants, which is pain and suffering.
Pena Nomba Soji Pinola, Musenka Yore, Kushenka Yore, Yore, Chuno Yomare, Kumaji Son, Mumasi Liore, they may so Liomari, the Koronga, Lola Matis.
Of course, Buddhists are people, and so there are Buddhists who've killed people, there are Buddhists who steal. They're human beings. They're not. So it's not that the Buddha's teaching tells them to kill, it tells them to steal. Of course not. But Buddhists are not all Buddhas. They're human beings. So of course, one can find fault.
Yambal Yapucha, Yambal Panto, Yang Tonda Liority, Naro Tonda, the Yang Tonda Tamandia, the Wajato, Chuno Somandia. Saint-Jack Saint-Jack Ropa Chalanda, Ting Aro said Tamandia, the Unite, Sonja Songa Aro, Dredgini, Karandoret. Saint-Jack Tonda, Saint-Jack Pemba Shigel, Sondua, Yenayo, Aroso Detamandia, Narongaro Tonda, the Chudo Maroni Kari, the Naro Yapo said Tamandia.
There's a big difference, actually, between what the teachings are encouraging us to do and what we actually do. So the teachings all telling us about benefiting other beings. But, I mean, how many other beings are we actually benefiting? And if we look practically, there's a big difference between what the teachings are ideally saying how we should live and actually how we do live. Mm-hmm. The Ringi Sungi Nangla, the Sota Dompa Rimpa Dungi Nangla, Chik Mena, then the Janchuk Sempi Dompa, Yapo Top Yamare, the Sungin de Ruchula, then the Sota Dompa, the Injiminji Chogalatene, Top Gugandugi, Shukindo. Yeah. So in order to take the bodhisattva vow, one needs one of the 7 types, any one of the 7 types of pratimoksha vow, and whichever one it is, it needs to have been formally taken through a ceremony. Then Mambo the Jantrop Sempi Dompa Shugenda, Yene Yang Sotaki Dompa Chogolatene Tomaso, Mambo de Drabo Yore, then Nangikisena.
Sotaka Domba de Chogala, Danny, Togo, Sonji Songo Bare, Sonji Sanji Domba, Chogala Matana Yondi. Risonore, Roto Igoniland, Sonore, Sotaga Domba in a Roto Igoniland, and Matasonore, Chong, the Cordon Balanton Sijera. Then you know, Sota read the Gary in a Tian Sonjeta, just a Jatamari Talanjavan Rojimere. In the Yana Yon, Shonchi Sanji Domba Picala, Mazeti Lamatin Gola and Sotaga Choga. Sandu Domba Tidu injury, not Tandu, Penangaro to Hog Domba Hidu, Gola and Tombo Sanduko, G2C, Teni, Shonchi Sanji G2C, Teni, Hog Domba, he then said to Domba, cut some other quarter, do the land in it, then I woke Sondon and Kama, Sasanto and Rodo injury, not Tandu, then Sandu Domba Yona, so I read Dungan, Kichondore, Togotini Domba and Chondore. Then the injury, they may. Domba Haji Jakakre, so that read down Kimena, Sonji Sanji Domba Tomare.
Then the Jancho Sempi Dompushu Choga Ginamla, then Pena.
Golano, Sandu Domba, Bodo injury, Inga Tandu.
Chandro Yenatan is Sota Domba Chirewa.
Oh, really, Sassans beginning, getting Domba Totare. They got to the Sota read down on Kito Dore, the Domba Tare.
That's the way it is technically, but if we look more closely, then this is probably what we'll come to tomorrow. When we look at the vows of self-liberation, then the very, very simplest form is refuge. And at the beginning of the actual ceremony for taking the bodhisattva vow, there is the refuge. So it's implicit within the ceremony. So it would be, in a way, because of the very way the ceremony is, that there wouldn't be. And practically most people would have taken refuge. And I think what we'll see tomorrow is there's refuge, or refuge plus 1 precept, 2 precepts of the different... refuge itself is a precept, and it's sort of the bare minimum of the pratimoksha. And because the refuge is included in that, or for instance, when we take a Vajrayana ceremony, initiation, or whatever it is, that always starts with refuge and bodhicitta. So, although they might not have been taken formally separately, they're included within the ceremony itself. So
맨날 가서 대주 자와장도 포모다 되게 온히들이라 응고라 못 보마지 가로 용당 세근도요. 되게 뒤노라 동보 샹도 랜선도 되니 현시 되니 동바 링이 도주도 들어가 또 지도 뭐지 저 되니 오무기 가비 그 희고래. 되니 세들이 동바 가마 들어가 또 노나나 동바 요나 요디오레메나 사바힌 거노 요래.
So, for instance, when we receive the Vajravarahi or Chakrasamvara empowerments and so on, then at the beginning there's the taking of refuge 3 times, there's the bodhicitta 3 times, then there's the taking of the various samayas for the 5 Buddha families and so on. All of that before the actual empowerment, which then has its own samaya that goes with for somebody who's received the empowerment. So either somebody's taken the basic steps separately, and then they build up on that when they go to bodhicitta or the Vajrayana, or else it's included when they take the bodhicitta or the Vajrayana ceremony.
베난도 도마보 다든지 지세조리데 또 태생 렌로레 니마 데라데 테메 드니 테간 유이만도 이거제 태생 소다리 거리 렌로레 드니랑 체바이 카가요레 이제도 소다리 등은이레 디에나요 니 다리라이야 태생 소다도 테메 소다 남아 니오레 더라 솜바고 모토마도 초카카가요 마랭이라이야 드니디라 뭐그 가서 나로 히드니 세지다도 우시 온종지 샘지 도만 부비 마로다 요제다 다 쪼도 태생 소다 이거시도 인지래 되면 태면 소다 이거시 기고 봐 말이 드니라 카가 체요래.
And we have to be maybe a little bit clearer about these self-liberation vows, and something Rinpoche said this afternoon, that when we categorize them, there can be Hinayana self-liberation vows and Mahayana self-liberation vows. So when we take the Bodhisattva vow or a Vajrayana ceremony, then it's true that included in that is self-liberation vow, but it's understood that that is a Mahayana self-liberation vow. We've seen before the actual commitment's the same, but the motivation's very different. And what we'll be looking at in the first chapters of Contro's text and tomorrow is the vows not working from the top downwards, but from the bottom upwards. So we'll be starting with Hinayana vows and what the commitments are when these vows are taken with a Hinayana motivation alone. In which case they need to be taken through a proper ceremony. Any sort of question? Okay. Anything. Rangi loju, rangi nampara dite sheruna.
가라가라가도 나로 녀게 자서 뒤도는 거 보셔서 동보 단지 다단다 쳐서 다죠 예지라 나가라 녀게 자서 뒤도는 거 이거 단다 쳐래 Teni ngama tezo nga kumbonda yo tapi jaba chaso kilo gachi ko donde. Tanga nondara.
Lo gasa kina na nishu.
Pache nga lo nye zani tasi titu tezo ko moyo nga drakono na yo re. Titu no kilo shira yo mare. Tada gachi kaso chi jo koru re ko don.
A long time ago he had hair. A long time ago he was thin.
인지라 빼 먹어져나 이라데 나 사고기네. 너서 뭐 치알았다 막 해자바데 되자들을 라네.
Can't understand why these Westerners think it's not good to be fat.
나야 뒤자시라 통문데.
Can't see anything wrong with it myself.
나시라 뒤자도 빼 깔리카본데. 양로만르시네 빼 깔리칸데 되면 뒤자시라 통문데.
Bit more difficult to walk around, but not bad.
알아가 로 ngama chundu ngala no lo je tong ji la de de ndu nyu to kon la nyon le te su xie nyu tani lo je sun je ge la pe sha ta nyu yu ta ge ge son che so ka ge la te nyu ta nga ge ge no ki pa ma tu xie ro me tani na pe sha pe yu pe mo bo ta nyu ndo ngo ka so la ye re bo pe sha ta nyu ya Drupon la ta lo je zong ji lan chong de de xie yu yan na yong nyo lan ya pu me ya pe ya pu xi ra ha ko me de se de ze ge san chi so ka ge re ka chong de pe en ke pa ma to to ma song da de nga song nang da wo nga ro yin san ge nga ro zhen de pe la ma ya pu 배게게 야포게도 줘서 등하는 거 다 손은 이제 배다다가 지양가마라 야포시오 선두가 게게 야포 초송가 라마 야포 단지 송가로 된지 더다다 배가 된디.
So to put it very briefly, Rinpoche's had about some 30 teachers of Buddhist studies, and he said he'd been so lucky because all of them were so excellent. They were all wonderful masters, each in their fields, and there wasn't one of them who wasn't really very, very capable and gifted. And he spent 8 years himself in retreat. He said, but, well, I was in retreat and my practice wasn't terrific, and I studied with those great teachers, and my study was, well, so-so, but...
Tani mahon pala ki pekho mombo su tani gomba je chuso mombo tu tendin da nga cha ki ko me mahon pala ya pekho mombo su je ki cha ki don ya tani gomba mombo je ya tani na chuso mombo tu je tendin nga cha ki me makala phan thu na yo ngaro ni pa ka yo ko masala phan thu na ngaro hiji ka yo ko la ta tendin da cha ki ma to ti la san de la ndu nga gong ban de nga chu zo de si tendin nga la cha ki ko me sha sha ka ta ma to ba re nji ba lo jira ti ngaro ko cha ki ko me mai karare.
And for himself, he has absolutely zero plans for making money, establishing organizations, having his own monasteries or set up. He says all he's really interested in is if anywhere there can be some benefit for somebody, then that's where he'll go. And the rest he's just not at all interested in. He doesn't feel he needs to set up his own monastery, doesn't feel he needs to go where the people make big offerings or anything like that.
Ni mahon pala yung song ni la tie zo phen thu bon da yo san du song jing nga ro thong ko na nga mahon pala